IR35 and the summer budget. My name is Kate Hardy and I'm Consultancy Manager here at QDOS.
My name is John Page and I'm the Assistant Consultancy Manager here at QDOS. A few weeks ago we received the first Conservative-only budget for the past 19 years. With that, they introduced what's been described as the four-pronged attack on personal service companies. The first announcement was the change in dividend taxation. They're going to scrap the 10% notional tax credit in place for a £5,000 tax-free allowance on dividends. Following that, you'll be taxed on either 7.5% if you're a basic rate payer, 32.5% if you're a high rate payer, or 38.1% if you're an additional rate payer. The second announcement was that if you're an umbrella company, working through an umbrella company, or through a personal service company, if you're working under the supervision, direction, or control of the end client, you are no longer going to be able to claim travel and subsistence expenses. Thirdly, while the employer national insurance contribution was increased from £2,000 to £3,000, this is no longer going to be available to personal service companies who have one sole employer and who is also the director. And the fourth announcement was that IR35 is currently ineffective and is going to be scrutinised.
Yeah, so following the summer budget, shortly afterwards we had the IR35 discussion document. So basically it opened, invited really people to, to discuss IR35, and in that document HMRC did come up with some suggestions, as to how they potentially thought IR35 could be changed. So they stated in the budget, obviously, that IR35 isn't effective as it currently stands, but it does specifically state within the document that there are no plans to abolish IR35. It has been suggested that perhaps more responsibility could be placed on the end user. So, perhaps when the end user hires contractors, they would need some sort of assurance, I suppose similar to what we have with the public sector, that contractors are genuinely operating outside of IR35. There was also the suggestion that more emphasis, or it could be the sole emphasis really, could be placed on supervision, direction and control. So that would be the key employment status test. And it was also suggested in there that there could be or that length of service could be used as a determining factor. So, for example, they did state in the discussion document that perhaps short-term contracts, perhaps lasting 6 months or less, would be classed as short contracts and therefore wouldn't be considered to be employment contracts because of the fact that they're of short duration, whereas longer contracts, would be subject to the IR35 rules, whatever they will be after when we find out after the discussion document closes. So moving on to one of the first questions we've received. Is IR35 likely to suffer the same criteria application as the pending travel and expenses legislation? If so, are the days of the independent contractor over? So the IR35 discussion document, it does emphasise or places more emphasis on supervision, direction and control, but it doesn't mean that just because of that the days of a PSC are going to be over. It doesn't mean that at all. It could mean that it might be more difficult for a contractor's status to be defended, because there will be just one status test that HMRC will look at. So it could mean that it could be a bit more difficult to defend your status, but certainly would not mean that it spells the end of PSCs or independent contractors, not at all. And at the moment, obviously the status tests that we have in place, are still being used and would still be just important as they always have been. So no, the answer to that question would be certainly not. It doesn't mean the end of independent contractors or PSCs.
Okay, moving on to question 2. For Before I go into this one, I would just mention that although we have welcomed questions over the past 2 weeks, you are still able to ask questions live to us now. There should be a column on the right-hand side of your screen. Feel free to ask us questions as we go through. We will try and answer all questions, the ones emailed in and any live ones. However, if we do run out of time, we will answer via Kudos Facebook page after this webinar. So question 2, does the dividend tax announcement make operating through a limited company pointless? No, I don't think it does. And while certainly the announcements will make a difference to a personal service company's tax liabilities, there is still a financial benefit of operating through a limited company, such as freedom to work with multiple end users, regaining control over your services and over your working life. There's a lack of mutuality between the parties, so you can move on to other contracts as and when you please. Also, some clients won't want employees and may only want to engage limited company contractors. So I think the market will demand that operating through limited companies is still in place for contractors. And also you can command a higher fee as a limited company contractor. I think this is something that we might see changing. I think fees might raise in line to cover the additional tax liabilities of personal service companies.
Okay, so the next question we have again is sort of around the control issue. So as HMRC have suggested that IR35 will be focused solely on control, will this make IR35 easier to assess? And I touched briefly on this sort of issue before, and potentially yes, it's likely to make I-35 easier to assess, in that you're more likely to know whether you're going to be inside or outside of I-35, where it will just be focused on one employment test. At the moment, like I said before, other tests will still be a factor, so we still have, right of substitution as the other, really key employment status test. And then, we would have to wait and see what happens when the discussion closes in September and they announce how I-35 is going to be changed. So I would still say that power of substitution at the moment is still going to be important, but yeah, in answer to the question, it could potentially make I-35 easier to assess, definitely.
Okay, so the next question: if the end user has responsibility to ensure personal service companies are operating correctly, will this reduce my responsibility? No, not really. Ultimately, IR35 is a limited company tax, and therefore the responsibility to ensure you're working compliantly will fall with the limited company. Now, what we might see is that the reporting guidelines or how the responsibility shifting to the end user will be in line with the public sector guidelines, like we saw in 2012, and they work in a similar way to this, whereas the end user must seek the assurance, and the contractor or the limited company has to prove their IR35 compliance to the end user. The only problem that we notice with public sector is that some of the end clients maybe got the wrong end of the stick with the public sector guidelines, and therefore stopped engaging limited companies out of fear, or out of, like I said, maybe they misunderstood the guidelines slightly. But in answer to the question, ultimately, it's the limited company's responsibility, so no, it won't reduce responsibility.
So moving on to the next question now, which is regarding length of service, really, and this is a common question that we get asked quite often, really, by contractors, regarding sort of length of service and how that fares really with regard to I-35. So the question asks, if HMRC now say that short contracts are not employment contracts, can I just get my agency to offer a series of short contracts? And also, what is considered short? So you could have the scenario where you have a contract that is with one particular client. And, you know, even if you ask the agency to say, could you just issue me, you know, a series of 6 months contracts, if ultimately they're for one client, then HMRC would see through that. And in the event of an I-35 inquiry, it would just be treated as one long contract. So there's no point really asking the agency just to issue short contracts, which are for one client, because they're just going to treat that as one inquiry anyway. You could potentially have lots of different clients, which are short-term contracts, and that would work a lot better from an I-35 perspective. So a series of short-term contracts, you know, would look much better from an I-35 point of view. We don't really know what HMRC would sort of quantify as short at the moment, unless, you know, that is specifically clarified at the end of the I-35 discussion when that closes. But for the public sector guidelines, it is actually 6 months, so they would only ask contractors whose contract is longer than 6 months to provide assurance under the public sector guidelines. So we could go down the same route, and they could potentially class short-term contracts as contracts of 6 months or less, which would sort of tie in well with the public sector guidelines.
Okay, so next question. If travel expenses are no longer claimable to contractors under the direction and control of the end client, if I'm IR35 compliant, this won't apply to me, will it? Well, it could do, as supervision, direction and control is only one test. There are other tests involved in IR35. When we're assessing IR35 status, whether it be in an inquiry or a contract assessment or assessing a limited company's working practices, we will always do that on an individual basis, case by case, because IR35 is a complex piece of legislation and we need to take into account all factors. For example, if we've defended inquiries where there may have been some control issues, but ultimately substitution was used. This enabled us to close the case. HMRC closed the inquiry and deemed that limited company as IR35 compliant. Now, in that scenario, they may be working under the supervision, direction and control. However, they are IR35 compliant. So it would be possible to be IR35 compliant, however, not be able to claim the expenses.
Okay, so next question, this is sort of around the importance of employment status tests. And the question asks, do you think control is a more important employment status test than right of substitution? And at the moment, I would say no. Control isn't more important than right of substitution, where there is a clear, genuine right to provide a substitute, for example, one that has been agreed by the end client, or if the right to provide a substitute has actually been exercised. I mean, that is a very clear indication that a contractor is operating outside of IR35. And we've dealt with I-35 inquiries previously where a contractor had actually provided a substitute, and subsequently, upon notifying HMRC of that, the case was actually closed down. So substitution is that important. Whether it will become less important after the discussion closes, you know, that remains to be seen. And it might be that they do sort of focus, or, you know, pour all their focus into supervision, direction and control. But at the moment, yeah, I would say that right of substitution is more important where there is a clear, genuine right to provide a substitute.
Okay, so the next question. Are there any plans to abolish IR35? Okay, in a word, no, not at this point. The discussion document has stated that whilst IR35 is currently ineffective, or not as effective as it could be, it's still important. They have announced that the tax yield from IR35 is low. However, a huge amount of tax is at stake, and as a deterrent alone, IR35 is considered to be successful. So in answer to the question, at this point in time, no, there are no plans to abolish IR35.
Okay, so the next question then. So does termination notice length, such as 1 day notice from the client, affect IR35 status? Well, actually, yes, it does. It does affect IR35 status. So, if the client can actually turn around to you and say, right, we're giving you 1 day's notice, and then, we no longer require your services, that does indicate a clear financial risk. After that 1 day, then, you're no longer providing services to the client. So although it's not conclusive by itself, it wouldn't conclusively put you outside of IR35, it certainly does, it is more consistent with running a business, and definitely would suggest that you are taking a financial risk, because, you can be, at a moment's notice, the contract can be terminated.
Okay, so next question. I do not work under the supervision, direction and control of the end client. Can I still claim all my travel expenses? Well, the travel and subsistence legislation that's currently in discussion, like I say, is currently in discussion. So at this point in time, carry on working and claiming expenses as you have been. But if the legislation is going to be put in place, and it's looking very much like it will be, yes, if you're not working under the supervision, direction and control, you could claim your travel expenses. However, it's important to take into account things such as the 24-month rule. So at the point that you are aware, if your contract is going to extend past 24 months, past that period, at that point you would no longer be able to claim expenses. But aside from that, the answer is yes, you would be able to claim your travel expenses.
And probably one of the most common questions we get asked really is, what can I do to put myself outside of IR35? And this is a difficult one to answer, because it's always very difficult to provide provide certainty with regard to IR35, because it's such a complex piece of tax legislation. But there are certain things you can do to sort of help improve your position from an IR35 perspective, or let you know exactly where you sort of stand with regard to IR35. So one of the best places to start really is to have a contract review, and this will normally be HMRC's first port of call in an I-35 inquiry. So they would ask to see copies of your contracts first. So actually having a compliant contract can actually help put an I-35 on the right footing, so it can really help to put a defence on the right footing from the outset. Also, having your working practices looked at is really important. The way a contractor actually provides the services on a day-to-day basis, the reality of the working practices, can actually be more important than the contract itself. So, making sure that your working practices reflect the positive clauses within the contract is also crucial from an I-35 point of view. And usually in any I-35 inquiry, HMRC, they will approach your end client directly, and they will ask them lots of questions regarding how you actually provide the services. So it's really important for you to make sure that the reality of your working practices does actually indicate that you're operating outside of I-35 too. Also, having your working practices confirmed and actually signed off by the end client can be really beneficial from an I-35 perspective. It can actually help speed up an I-35 inquiry too. And although a signed statement from the end client wouldn't stop HMRC from approaching them directly in an inquiry, what it does do is at least give you some confidence that you know what the end client are likely to say if they're approached by HMRC. So you've got a degree of confidence that the end client are going to be supportive of your status. Now, one of the best things you can do from an I-35 perspective is actually provide a substitute. This will demonstrate that you're an independent contractor, it's a business providing services, and that there isn't a requirement for an individual. So it's a business entity providing the services. And, you know, like I mentioned before, where contractors have actually provided a substitute, you know, ultimately where that has been proven to HMRC, then they will usually close the case down. What you can also do as well is actually put in place some insurance, so some tax inquiry insurance. You know, this means that you know, right from the outset of an inquiry, you have experts that can handle the case for you and that know the I-35 case law inside out, and that are there from day one really to support you right through the entire process. I mean, that can be you know, very beneficial to contractors, and particularly, I mean, our tax liability cover actually does cover their tax, interest and penalties in the event that a contractor is considered to be caught by I-35. So for contractors that are particularly concerned about I-35 and want that peace of mind, you know, that's what that policy is designed for, really. So, you know, there's lots of things that you can do to sort of protect yourself from an I-35 inquiry. And, you know, I think any contractor that sort of goes down that route and gets their contract looked at and their working practices looked at, you know, are in a much better position from an I-35 point of view.
Okay, well, that's all the time we've got for today, but we'd like to thank you for all your questions that you sent in, and also for the live questions that we've had today during this webinar. If you do think of any more questions, or you'd like to question further the ones we have answered today, please feel free to still send those in. We will look at those over the next couple of days. We'll answer those on the QDOS Facebook page.
Yep, so thanks very much for listening, and once the discussion document on I-35 does close, obviously we will let you know as soon as possible, obviously, what happens with regard to that. So like I said, thanks again for listening.